Let me start and jump right in with the most cliche of metaphors for our relationship with technologies, right? And that's the GPS on our phones. We all know that dual feeling. On the one hand, relief, no more sort of planning routes before we set off, juggling street names or wrong terms, at least when it works properly. But generally described as a classic example of cognitive outsourcing that frees us up to notice things, notice the architecture of the city, or listen to a podcast, or simply go on an explorative walk or drive without fear of getting lost. But there's another feeling too, that in sort of outsourcing the building of mental maps over time, we've let that capacity atrophy, right? At least if you're like me, I increasingly find myself using GPS just to be sure, even for routes that I know. So, like with most technologies, GPS both has a story we could tell of, in one hand, liberating us, and on the other, weakening us in some sense. And that tug of war of unburdening versus outsourcing is very much at the heart of debates around advanced AI. Wherever AI crops up, we can tell these two competing narratives, one of great unburdening, liberation, new capabilities flourishing, and one of great outsourcing, of potential de-skilling, or alienation, or loss of meaning and control. And my plan for this session is to use those two narratives to revisit some of the themes that have come up in this bite-size ethics series. So this series included things like human AI relationships, the implications of AI on automating work, teaching ethics to AI, as well as other issues to do with sustainability, the attention economy, automating moral reasoning. These are all online on YouTube for those who missed them or want to revisit them. Here, I'll only revisit a couple of these themes and look at how these two narratives of unburdening and outsourcing play out for each other, but also how those narratives can obscure the often difficult questions we have to confront when it comes to the specific trade-offs associated with a use case of the technology. And I'll end by zooming out a bit and talk a bit about some of the AI governance strategies gaining some attention, and that aim to respond to the kind of deep uncertainties about AI that I'll be discussing. And the unburdening narrative when it comes to work, it's really sort of as old as the story of human progress, if you will. So for most of history, work has been fairly brutal, right? Subsistence farming, dangerous factories, long hours of drudgery. While this kind of progress is far from universal, and immense struggles for workers' rights obviously continue, the past 2 centuries have seen technology and labor advocacy dramatically ease the worst of these conditions in many societies. So, for instance, hours have fallen from 60 to 70 a week in industrializing countries to roughly half of that today. You can see there are various exceptions, but it's certainly a general trend. And the promise of AI is to extend this arc, right? The promise is not only to end the worst kinds of physical labor, but also, the soul-crushing cognitive grind of endless emails and long commutes, fluorescent offices, and at least for a lot of workers, meaningless tasks for faceless shareholders. And in fact, surveys suggest that only about 1 in 5 workers globally feel engaged by their jobs in the sense of being really involved in, enthusiastic about, or committed to their work or workspace. Well, obviously, that will vary hugely country to country or sector to sector. But you can see that would sort of signal at the lure of AI as the possibility of true freedom, right? To automate more and more work so there's more time, family, new hobbies, the chance to live a richer life on one's own terms. But there's also the outsourcing narrative, right? And let's just, for this talk, put aside the huge sort of economic questions, right? How we'd all get access to the resources necessary for a flourishing life in a world of automated work, and what that might mean for our individual rights if human labor is, obsolete or very quickly disrupted in some way. I want to focus instead on more specific question of whether it's even obvious that a life of total leisure, or just a life where there's the opportunity of total leisure if you want it, is a happier, more fulfilling one. So some might worry that the absence of work is not the same as the presence of meaning. Work, however tedious or exploitative, has been also for many, a primary structure around which things like identity, purpose, and social connection are built. Strip that away without replacing it with something similarly binding, and we might rightly be worried that we'll discover maybe a subtler kind of deprivation, basically something like the slow erosion of direction, the fading of skills that once grounded a sense of competence, and maybe some kind of fraying of social bonds that came from some shared labor or some sense of collective struggle. And that narrative, can point to various cautionary hints from, say, modern retirees who sometimes face depression or a sense of self-worth when their careers end abruptly, or perhaps even lottery winners who report feeling isolated and who quickly kind of revert to feeling no more fulfilled than before. So you have these two competing narratives, right? AI as liberation from being unburdened by work, and AI as potential loss of meaning or alienation by outsourcing work. So which narrative makes more sense, one of unburdening or one of outsourcing? And what I want to suggest is that the trouble with grand narratives is that they don't really face up to the fairly uncomfortable reality of trade-offs, right? And these aren't abstract puzzles. These are trade-offs that cash out as fairly concrete, uneasy choices about things like who bears risks, who benefits, what kinds of harms and uncertainties are acceptable or tolerable when weighed against potential benefits. But to make this concrete, suppose you're a policy maker looking at our best statistical models for the likely impact of automating work on a population. And suppose it indicates a high likelihood that, say, for every million adults who substantially reduce their dependence on paid work, you can expect some, let's say, some 100 among them will experience clinically significant depression. Maybe some further 100 will develop a substance use disorder, and some non-zero number will die earlier than they otherwise would, either through suicide or downstream health effects of isolation. And no doubt there aren't any such statistical models that could give us an absolutely, accurate set of numbers. But I think it would be uncontroversial to think that, yeah, it would be bizarre if there were not at least some such costs, right? Because whenever large groups of people undergo major shifts in daily structure or identity and social connection, some fraction reliably struggle in ways that show up in mental and physical health. And then the question becomes, well, how many such harms should we be prepared to accept in order to grant a potentially much larger group more time, autonomy, health, and self-direction? And is the answer different if, for example, those risks are concentrated among, say, already vulnerable groups? Does our tolerance change if we can mitigate some harms, for instance, with strong social infrastructure or universal mental health access or community programs, but still not eliminate them? And I think when you frame it this way, it becomes clear why sort of these grand narratives and vague intuitions won't do, right? We're trying to we're being asked to make explicit value-laden judgments about acceptable risk, distributional fairness, and the moral weight of different kinds of loss, right? Decisions that I don't think can be settled by slogans about liberation or alienation alone, though they can certainly be buried behind those slogans. And we see a similar issue with AI-human relationships. And I'll move a bit more quickly here. So loneliness has been increasingly called a public health crisis. And here the great unburdening narrative is one of potentially profound comfort for some, right? So AI companions, empathetic, always available, have in fact been shown to reduce at least the experience or reported experience of loneliness in some specific contexts, sometimes as much as human conversation. So imagine it's 2 a.m., someone who might otherwise spiral alone can press a button and feel heard and speak to an AI companion that helps ground them in some sense. For, say, an elderly widow, a disabled adult, or an anxious teenager, this is not, I think, a trivial convenience. It can be a real lifeline, and we've seen many such cases already, although, I would say, these studies are still fairly early and lack sort of raise all sorts of questions about replication. But the outsourcing narrative also warns us that companionship is a skill, right? It's built through friction, through patience, compromise, vulnerability, and AI companions remove that friction, right? They're perfectly attentive, never demanding, and that may sound ideal in some circumstances, but also seeing evidence suggesting that overuse can backfire, right? Greater dependence, less real-world socializing, even tragic outcomes where reliance spirals into isolation and even suicide. And again, behind those two narratives are some very uncomfortable trade-offs, right? How do we weigh potentially extraordinary benefits for some of the most isolated against the risk that others will slide into dependence, losing the skill that human companionship require, right? Exactly how many cases of harm or tragedy are tolerable for the sake of offering comfort to those who might otherwise have none, right? And I think there's also a deeper uncertainty here because obviously we don't know how many will benefit and how many will be harmed. We don't know what other unintended consequences may arise. We don't know what other social norms will develop as the technology sort of matures and proliferates. And so perhaps the hardest part is that we won't know until after the fact. And people have very different intuitions about how to make decisions under that kind of uncertainty. Now, let's revisit the theme of the session on moral agency and specifically this idea of encoding or teaching ethics to AI, whether implicitly or explicitly. So think of things like, healthcare triage, loan approvals, self-driving cars. And there, the unburdening story says, look, AI forces us to spell out how it should act under conditions of high moral stakes, right? And by doing so, we sharpen our own values. A properly designed AI system doesn't just churn out results, right? It can cut through bias, it can bring consistency, and it can leave some kind of trail of decisions that we can actually audit. And so in that sense, AI can surface reasons that we routinely miss, right? And apply standards even-handedly, whether that means catching misdiagnosis in a scan or flagging a wrongful loan denial. And in that light, AI isn't replacing human judgment, it's carrying out our judgment and stepping in where humans are notoriously sloppy, biased, or inconsistent. Okay. On the other hand, the outsourcing story says, look, these systems will dissolve responsibility and meaningful control. We know that people have a tendency to overtrust automation. We know that AI can quietly shift its outputs in harmful ways. So a hiring algorithm might quietly downgrade women's CVs, or a medical model can deny care to minorities, not because anyone necessarily intended it, but because responsibility was scattered across design choices that are just incredibly hard to keep track of. And sure, humans might remain in the loop, but very likely they'll be quickly reduced to just rubber stamping outputs. In other words, control without real control. But here's where the two neat narratives kind of miss the plot, right? So this worry about a responsibility fog, I think that's not just about diluted blame. It's also about the risk of system shock, right? Errors that accumulate quietly beneath the surface and then erupt catastrophically, at least potentially. And by definition, we won't know until it's too late, right? So should we be far more risk averse here, even when there seems to be a clear upside? Because presumably the upside is real, right? Faster, potentially fairer medical triage that could save thousands of lives over time, financial systems that flag fraud, which human auditors routinely miss, self-driving cars that could prevent countless accidents. Are those gains worth running an indeterminate risk of a silent catastrophic failure? That's the kind of knife edge that the two narratives don't really engage with. Okay, apologies for moving fast here. There's a lot to cover and not much time. What I've tried to convey so far is that across AI in work, in relationships, moral agency, we see the same pattern: unburdening on one hand versus outsourcing on the other. And between them, there are a set of hard trade-offs about how much potential autonomy, connection, safety we're willing to buy at the potential cost of control, fairness, and trust. And in a sense, AI doesn't create these conflicts so much as amplify them. So you could argue what makes AI distinctive here from other technologies is that it forces us to hard code our values, right? To pick criteria, to set thresholds, to make trade-offs explicit that we usually leave fuzzy. So a hiring algorithm trained on past data might quietly prioritize efficiency over fairness, reinforcing inequalities in work. An autonomous vehicle might make a split-second decision in an accident, literally operationalizing one ethical framework over another. And that's why kind of this popular idea of the AI alignment problem can be fairly misleading here, right? So AI alignment suggests there is this single coherent set of human values for which AI needs to align with, when in fact our values are actually fairly fractured and contested from the start. We're not, in fact, aligned with ourselves. And so the challenge is not so much reaching alignment, it's closer to trying to achieve political legitimacy for how AI is deployed and used in the face of our own disagreements and uncertainties. And what that means is we don't need a single answer for which narrative is true. We need frameworks that that sort of facilitate us living with disagreements, adapting under uncertainty, and ultimately checking the power of those setting the trajectory for everyone else. The problem here is that the usual institutions we deploy for this, at least the ones typically associated with some kind of liberal democracy, which is at bottom, a set of institutions and procedures for living together under disagreement through the use of things like elections, courts, open debates. The challenge is that those mechanisms and processes are, pretty slow, fairly blunt. They were not designed to deal with technologies that can potentially shift whole domains and the time it takes a parliamentary committee to meet. So the question is, how can we supplement these institutions with mechanisms that are more responsive without losing legitimacy? So let me sort of kind of pivot by taking that step back I mentioned at the start and looking at two frameworks that increasingly appear in the AI governance literature. And the first is what we might call democratic experimentalism, right? And the basic unit here is the Citizens Assembly, which is basically a representative mini public, typically selected by lottery, paid for the time, given briefings, and opposing expert testimony, and who are then asked to deliberate and issue recommendations with majority and minority reports. And the point there isn't to discover truth, it's to surface a stable, legitimate public judgment under value conflict on uncertainty. And the specifics of the design matter a lot. You can make assemblies standing, basically a pool that reconvenes regularly or quarterly, or they can be more like sprint panels that run for 5-7 days on a narrow question. You can set mandates, as in their outcomes can be binding for regulators, or they could only be agenda setting for regulators. You can define triggers, and you can require full transparency of reading packs, conflicts, and voting records. And, the devil is going to be in the details there. And very broadly, the strength of these assemblies is that they widen who decides before deployment, right? They make trade-offs explicit, and they can generate a social license you can point to for deployment. On the other hand, they require time, they're costly, and they can be very sensitive to agenda design and involve fairly slow feedback as well. There are some practical patches that are also gaining more and more traction. So, pre-trained standing juries that can convene fairly quickly, standardized pros and cons briefs, structured argument maps. There's actually interesting work on how large language models themselves can be used to facilitate and potentially speed up citizen assemblies, as well as reduce the costs associated with them. I have an example of that in the readings that I'll share at the end. But in practice, the bottom line here is that this is a kind of, this kind of democratic deliberation could give us a way to try and price and bound the kinds of uncomfortable trade-offs we just walked through, right? So for instance, on automating work, an assembly can set acceptable risk thresholds for a transition to more leisure, for example, by stipulating we will tolerate up to X additional cases of clinical depression per million adults shifting hours, conditional on funding some certain number of mitigation strategies, and reviewing outcomes every certain number of months. Or on AI companionship, for instance, juries can specify safeguards that balance relief against dependence, things like age gating, time of day caps, escalation to human support after defined distress signals, and transparency about things like synthetic or artificial empathy. And so the overall promise here is that these deliberations can turn these fuzzy anxieties around trade-offs into something closer to auditable commitments, right? If harms exceed the agreed thresholds, the Assembly's terms force a response, things like tighten safeguards, pause a deployment class, or redirect funds to mitigation. If benefits materialize without the forecast downsides, then the mandates can ratchet down, right? Either way, we move away from slogans like freedom versus erosion to explicit, reviewable trade-offs. Let me quickly shift to the second lever, and I'll very briefly mention here, which we might call market accountability through insurance and liability. And the idea is very straightforward. If your AI system causes harm, you're held financially responsible. If you are operating in a high-risk area, you have to carry insurance, just like drivers do, or like doctors with malpractice coverage. That way, insurers, not just regulators, become a constant check on the purveyors of the technology. And the idea is that for those insurers to protect themselves, they will insist on safety audits, clear record keeping, and proof that systems have been properly tested before they even agree to insure them. And because insurance premiums rise when risk is higher, the cost of coverage becomes a simple real-time signal. Safer systems cost less, riskier ones riddled with uncertainty cost more. Yeah, 2 more minutes here. We see this logic at work in other fields, right? So airlines have to carry liability insurance, which makes them obsessively attentive to safety. Hospitals and surgeons operate under malpractice insurance, which pressures them to follow standards of care. And applying this to AI is just extending a model that already keeps a whole lot of industries accountable. I'll jump just to this slide here. The problem with liability is that it is reactive, right? So it only adjusts after something goes wrong, right? So that works for common risks, but it's not enough on its own for catastrophic ones, where even a single failure could be devastating. But it's worth adding that these two mechanisms can work together. So you have citizen assemblies that can help us decide upfront what risks we're willing to take and what safeguards must be in place. And you have insurance and liability that then make those safeguards matter in practice by putting a price on ignoring them. So in that sense, one of them widens who decides before systems go live. The other tightens who pays after they do. Neither is obviously a silver bullet, but they can give us a practical rule of thumb, right? Decide together, measure honestly, and make the beneficiaries carry the risks they create. Okay, let me leave it there. Basically, tried to do two things. I've framed the AI debate through the competing narratives of unburdening and outsourcing, and tried to highlight the difficult trade-offs that these sort of grand narratives can obscure. They tempt us into choosing sides in a debate that misrepresents the real task at hand. The real task, I think, isn't to pick a winning narrative. It's to build the machinery of governance needed to navigate messy, uncomfortable trade-offs. And to avoid leaving you all with a what now abrupt ending, I've given you a couple of examples from the AI governance literature on how we might consider responding to those uncertainties about trade-offs. And yeah, I hope you found that interesting and useful. And thanks very much. And here are some readings.